Day after day, as we take our journey through the Bible together, one thing that we continue to see and hear very clearly, no matter what book of the Bible we're looking at, is the call of God to His people to simply trust Him to be God. And in today's reading from Daniel chapters 1 to 6, we see multiple examples of what that kind of trust looks like. So God's people are in exile in Babylon for their centuries of idolatry and rebellion and faithlessness to God. But God is still their God. In chapter 1, He blesses 4 young men from Judah with vast knowledge and great wisdom, and He gives them favor with King Nebuchadnezzar so that they become His most trusted servants and advisors. Then in chapter 2, the king has a dream that disturbs him, and none of his wise men can tell him what it means. But Daniel trusted that God would give him the interpretation of the dream, and he did. And the result was that the most powerful king on earth declared that Daniel's God was the God of all gods and the Lord of all kings. But then in chapter 3, King Nebuchadnezzar makes a massive golden statue of himself, and he decrees that anyone who does not bow down and worship the image would be thrown into the fiery furnace. Well, Daniel's companions, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were faithful servants of the Lord, and so there was no way that they would bow before anyone but God. Nebuchadnezzar heard this, and he was furious. So he sent for the young men, and he threatened them. He said, "You bow down in front of this image right now, or I'm going to throw you in the furnace." And they answered him with one of the greatest statements of faith in all of the scriptures. They said, "God is able to deliver us from the fire, and He will deliver us, O King. But even if He does not," did you hear that? Even if He does not. In other words, even if we have to die for our faith, even if God doesn't deliver us from our current difficulty, we will not bow down or compromise our trust in Him as God alone. So Nebuchadnezzar has them thrown into the furnace, but the fire doesn't harm them. And when the king looked inside, he saw a 4th man standing with them in the fire. No doubt, the presence of Jesus Himself with His faithful servants. And Nebuchadnezzar recognized the greatness of God. But over time, he started getting proud of his own greatness, his own power, his own wealth. He looked out over his kingdom and said, "Didn't I make all of this by my power and my glory?" And in response, the Lord humbled Nebuchadnezzar, making him like an animal living in the field, it says, for 7 years. And then when the Lord restored him to his throne, Nebuchadnezzar knew, without a doubt, who the true king was. This is what he says of the Lord. His dominion is everlasting. His kingdom will endure forever. His ways are true. And I, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, give all praise and all honor to Him, the King of heaven. In chapter 6, King Darius is now the king, and some government officials convince him to make a decree that whoever prays to any god but the king himself would be thrown into a den of lions. You see, they were jealous of Daniel, and they knew that Daniel wouldn't obey this decree because they knew that Daniel loved God and trusted God much more than he feared death. And sure enough, they caught Daniel praying to the Lord, and they reported him to King Darius. Now, King Darius loved Daniel, and he didn't want to kill him, but he had made a decree that couldn't be changed, and so he had to have Daniel thrown to the lions. But before he did it, the king told Daniel privately, "I know that your God is going to deliver you." In the morning, after a sleepless night, King Darius ran to the lion's den and found out that the Lord had, in fact, delivered Daniel. And the result of this, again, was that the most powerful king on earth made a decree to people of every nation that they are to worship the God of Daniel because He is the living God and His kingdom will rule forever. And the Lord proved once again, by strengthening the hearts of His faithful servants and by changing the hearts of godless kings, that even in the most painful and difficult circumstances, He can always be trusted to be God.